In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not often told, stories shaped by human strength and human failure. This is one of those stories. The accounts we share now reach back through time to reveal moments that changed the world. Let us begin by travelling into a past long forgotten yet still echoing into our present. The year was 1095, and a great movement stirred one that would travel over lands and seas, altering history forever. Common people from all walks of life, farmers, crafters, mothers and children left behind their homes and families. They walked away from the safety of their villages and their everyday lives. They marched towards a distant land, a place most knew only from stories and sermons. These were not trained soldiers. Many had no weapons, no money and no plan for the dangerous road ahead. Still they went forward, pushed by a promise, by fear, by hope, by faith. What force could make whole communities walk thousands of miles across harsh and foreign ground, straight into the heart of danger and war? What belief held such power that people would risk everything and give their lives for it? Now we follow their tale, a story of devotion and violence, courage and contradiction. It started with a call from a distant pope and grew into one of the most powerful and bloody movements the world has ever known. The First Crusade. By the late 11th century, the Mediterranean was no calm sea of united kingdoms. It was a mix of states and empires that fought as much as they traded. 3 great cultures ruled the area, each shaped by long years of history, and now standing at a turning point, Byzantium, heir to the old Roman world, spread across the Balkans and parts of Asia Minor. The Islamic world covered vast lands from Spain to Central Asia. And in the Latin Christian West, a once divided society began to look outward with fresh ambition. These 3 centres were connected. Pilgrims, merchants and messengers crossed borders, carrying tales, goods and complaints. This was a world where friendship and rivalry lived side by side. The Byzantine Empire showed amazing endurance through the ages. By the middle of the 11th century it kept its Greek culture and Orthodox faith, yet its political ground had grown unsteady. One event above all showed its weakness: the defeat at Manzikert in 1071. There the Seljuk Turks broke Byzantine defences and took over much of Anatolia, a land that gave the empire taxes and soldiers. Even the Emperor Romanos IV was taken captive. In an act rarely remembered today, his captors set him free unharmed and treated him with respect. That brief kindness stood in sharp contrast to the cruelty that would mark later fights when war took on a holy character. Still, the loss left Byzantium shaken and hungry for friends, a weakness that would soon shape its cries to the west. Looking south and east, the Islamic world of this time was not the united front. It once was under the great caliphates. The Abbasids in Baghdad held symbolic weight, but real power lay with local rulers. In Egypt, the Fatimids held control with their Shia faith. Further east, the Seljuks, once Turkic nomads who embraced Islam, rose to power. Their military strength not only humbled Byzantium, but changed the balance of the Near East. But even as they grew, rivalry between these powers meant the Islamic world was split in politics and religion. Strangely, when Crusaders first marched, Jerusalem was not in Seljuk hands but under the Fatimids. So their campaign would strike at rulers who held the city, not those who had lost it. Meanwhile, in the Latin West, a different change was unfolding. After centuries often called dark, Western Europe saw more people, better harvests, and a deep faith that filled daily life. Lords gathered armed men through feudal bonds, creating a society built for war. Yet beside this stood a strong culture of devotion. Pilgrimage became a clear sign of faith. Drawing all classes to shrines as far as Jerusalem, Italian merchant cities like Genoa and Venice thrived in this air, turning trade into a tool of war. With knights eager for glory, merchants seeking business, and believers hoping for salvation, all the pieces were in place for a new age of conflict. By the mid-11th century, pilgrimage was a common part of Christian life in Western Europe. People from all walks made long journeys to sacred sites, often walking hundreds or thousands of miles. The holy city of Jerusalem was the most honoured goal. But Rome and Santiago de Compostela also drew countless travellers. For many pilgrims, the act promised God's forgiveness, and the physical hardship itself was seen as an act of faith. Families sometimes sold land or goods to gather what was needed for the trip, a sacrifice that shows how deep this practice ran. The pilgrimage was seldom safe or easy. Bandits on the roads, outbreaks of sickness and shifting politics posed constant threats. Yet strong faith fed their will, and streams of pilgrims went on, even with the risk of never coming home. When they reached Jerusalem, they often found the city open to them. Since Muslim rulers generally allowed Christian travellers to come, usually for practical reasons, as pilgrims brought money and helped diplomacy. But this access began to waver once the Seljuk Turks moved into the Near East. Their fights with other Muslim dynasties created instability, and Christian travellers spoke of harassment as routes grew less safe. Tales of being turned away or mistreated spread in Europe, fueling calls for action. Beside these pilgrimage habits, a new idea grew around the role of knights, the notion of milites. Christi, or soldiers of Christ, tried to join warrior values with the church's. Hope's Christianity had long been unsure about violence, but the feudal world needed armed men trained to fight. To make peace with this, religious thinkers said the same skills used for private wars could defend the faith. In this view, the sword was no longer just a tool for personal revenge or ambition, it could serve as an instrument of piety. This thinking drew on earlier Christian thought, especially Augustine's idea of just war. He argued that violence might be right under lawful authority for moral reasons. During the 11th century, church reformers applied that idea to defending Christendom itself. From there grew the notion of penitential war, where joining a church-approved fight could bring forgiveness of sins like completing a pilgrimage war, was now seen not as a stain on the soul, but as a path to salvation. If fought under church guidance and for the faith's defence. These ideas deeply changed how Christian Europe saw violence. Preachers began urging knights to fight in God's name, not just for their lords. Some warriors even took up odd practices like using blunt maces instead of swords to avoid spilling blood, though the result was just as deadly. Pilgrims often carried symbolic items like a bag, a staff, or a scallop shell signs. So well known that even fakes sometimes wore them to get food or sympathy together, these cultural ways laid the ground for the extraordinary call to arms about to ignite. In November of 1095, Pope Urban II stood before clergy and nobles at the Council of Clermont in southern France. The setting seemed like another church meeting, but what happened changed medieval history forever. Urban gave a sermon that did more than ask for a political alliance or a single military campaign. His words lit a fire that swept through Christian Europe, reshaping how faith and violence were joined. At the heart of his appeal was a request from Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos, pressed by Seljuk advances in Anatolia. Alexios needed Western soldiers to help take back lost land. Urban used this plea to push a larger vision of Christian unity. He presented the offer of aid not as mere politics, but as a chance for Western knights to turn their fighting skills toward a sacred goal. By doing so, he also advanced his own aim to lift papal power, hoping to tie a divided Christendom more tightly under Rome's lead. Building on the strong tradition of pilgrimage, Urban redefined the journey east as an armed act of penance. He urged his audience to take the cross, a phrase that merged pilgrimage ritual with a military mission. This was a turning point in medieval thought, where fighting under church blessing was no longer seen as a sin but as salvation. To stir hearts further, Urban spoke of alleged wrongs done to Christians in holy places like Jerusalem, tales of ruined churches. Massacres and humiliations were told. Though many reports were stretched or made up, the goal was not truth but persuasion. The crowd reacted with passion, and later writers kept different versions of the speech, some stressing piety, others the grim stories. The effect was instant. Word of this proclamation raced across Europe. Nobles saw land and status. Peasants heard the promise of redemption. Even those on society's edges saw a way out by marching east. Historians now think Urban himself may have only pictured aid for Byzantium, not the eventual capture of Jerusalem. Whatever his plan, the force he unleashed went beyond his control. The rallying cry of that day, Deus vult, or God wills it, spread fast through towns and villages, becoming the unifying call of a movement that would soon cross continents. Before the knights and nobles had even raised their banners, another movement swept Europe in the spring of 1096. This was not the planned expedition pushed by lords and bishops, but a flood of zeal from peasants, minor knights, and self-named holy men. Later called the People's Crusade, it was less an army than a wandering mass of believers. They carried the same promise of salvation preached at Clermont, but lacked the wealth, skill, or leaders needed for such a task. At its centre stood figures like Peter the Hermit, a preacher whose visions of divine guidance convinced thousands the long trek to Jerusalem could be done with faith alone. These groups travelled with families, livestock and carts loaded with whatever they could drag along. Unlike the nobles who would later secure funds and supplies, they lived on scavenging and charity. Belief replaced planning, and trouble came almost at once. Many held the simple idea that the holy city lay just past the next hill, not grasping the vast distance to their goal. For some, hunger, tiredness and the strain of the road killed them before they even left European soil. The thought that heavenly reward outweighed any earthly suffering turned their march into something closer to a moving shrine than a military campaign. But the journey did not stay peaceful. Along the Rhine Valley, several groups turned violent against Jewish communities in towns like Worms, Mainz and Cologne. On the surface, headed to free distant Jerusalem, they committed massacres against neighbours, looted property and forced conversions. These events formed a dark prelude to the campaign often lost next to battles in the east. They show how unstable this wave of religious zeal could be when free from central authority. By the time the Crusaders reached Byzantine lands, Emperor Alexios I saw the danger they brought. He had asked for seasoned fighters, not crowds of wild zealots troubling his people, wanting them away from Constantinople before they caused more harm. He arranged their crossing over the Bosporus into Asia Minor. There left mostly on their own, they became easy targets for the Seljuk Turks near Nicaea. In the late summer of 1096, their lack of armour supplies and tactics led to a terrible ambush. Within days, their scattered groups were cut down. Leaders like Walterson Avoir fell in battle while Peter the Hermit pulled back to Constantinople before the fight. Few survived, and what began with huge crowds ended in ruin. Militarily, the People's Crusade did nothing, yet it showed how wide and rash the hunger for holy war had grown. Even farmers on oxen villages with farm tools, and one odd band following a goose they saw as heaven sent, believed themselves part of a sacred mission. In the last weeks of 1096, a far more organised wave of crusaders began to gather across Europe. Historians call this the Prince's Crusade. Unlike the unruly masses of the earlier People's Crusade, these were armies led by seasoned nobles, men with resources, dreams and reputations built in war. They came not under one banner, but as rival groups united by a shared promise, eternal reward through service to the cause. Each group came from a different part of Latin Christendom. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, gathered men from modern Belgium and the Rhineland. From southern France marched Raymond IV of Toulouse, already among the richest lords in the region. The Norman world sent its own commanders, with Bohemond of Taranto raising forces from southern Italy, and his nephew Tancred joining him, known for boldness. Robert, son of William the Conqueror of England, left Normandy to take part, while Hugh of Vermandois, brother of King Philip I of France, brought his followers too. Each leader held hopes shaped by home politics and the lure of fame abroad. Some expected only glory and forgiveness. Others also eyed the chance to seize lands in the east. Their companies looked nothing like the ragged pilgrims of the earlier try. The princes brought mounted knights, archers, foot soldiers, and even engineers skilled with siege gear. Priests came with them to hear confessions and lead worship, while merchants and camp followers swelled their numbers. Many nobles also hired writers to record their path, not just to save events, but to make their own names immortal. The expedition had become as much about reputation as piety. Every army met at Constantinople, where Emperor Alexios I Komnenos faced a hard choice. He needed the Crusaders' strength to regain lost territory, but he also feared their ambitions to guard Byzantine interests. He demanded oaths of loyalty, insisting that retaken lands be returned to imperial control. Some leaders swore, seeing the political need. Others saw little reason to keep such promises once victory gave them possession. Among them was Beaumont, whose smarts and striking presence made him one of the most formidable figures of the whole campaign. Chroniclers described him in terms saved for mythical warriors, a sign of the mark he left on his time. By the spring of 1097, the many groups had crossed into Asia Minor under Byzantine escort ahead, lay the strongholds of the Seljuk Turks, and for the first time Crusaders faced the test of organised battle on foreign soil. What began as scattered vows across Europe had grown into a multi-pronged army ready to attempt the unthinkable. After their success at Nicaea, the Crusader armies moved deeper into Asia Minor, turning toward one of the toughest strongholds in the region, Antioch. The city was not only huge, but also placed to guard routes between Anatolia and Syria. Its great walls, stretching for miles with hundreds of towers, made it one of the hardest targets of the entire campaign. Yet taking it was key. Without Antioch, the road to Jerusalem was blocked. The Crusaders settled around the city in October of 1097, starting an ordeal that lasted nearly 8 months. The defenders were led by Yagi Siyan, the Seljuk appointed governor. He had readied for the attack, strengthening gates and storing supplies. The attackers, though, soon found themselves trapped by their own choice. Antioch could not be taken by force, and a blockade stretched their resources thin. By winter, the Crusaders faced such shortages that knights sold armour or weapons to buy food. Horses, once the pride of mounted warriors, were killed for meat. Some writers later recorded unthinkable acts like boiling leather to survive the cold months. Many left slipping back toward friendly ground, hoping to find better conditions than the starvation at the walls. Despite these hardships, cracks formed inside the city itself. Early in 1098, Beaumont of Taranto made secret contact with an Armenian defender named Firuz who controlled one tower. Promises were exchanged, and on the night of June 3rd the gate was opened to Crusader troops. In brutal fighting through the streets, Antioch fell to the Crusaders, who poured into the city after months of need. But the win proved brief because almost at once a large force under Kerboga of Mosul arrived. Suddenly the Crusaders were trapped inside the very walls they had just taken. The besiegers became the besieged. Conditions worsened fast. Kerboga led a force drawn from across Mesopotamia, and his numbers outweighed the defenders. Inside the city, morale fell and doubts about survival ran deep. It was in this air that a lowborn visionary named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have found the Holy Lance, the spear said to have pierced Christ on the cross. Digging under a church floor, he brought up an iron point that many took as proof of divine favour. Whether fake or real, the timing renewed will among tired soldiers. On June 28th, with Kerboga's army still outside, the Crusaders marched out of the city. Their numbers were small next to their enemies. Yet Kerboga's coalition broke apart, rival lords refusing to work under his command. The Crusaders used this split, striking hard and routing an army that should have crushed them. The victory became legendary, hailed as proof that heavenly power guided their cause. Yet even in triumph, darker details remained. Reports spread of men turned to cannibalism during the leanest days, tales that chroniclers awkwardly explained away. And Peter Bartholomew, whose vision had lifted spirits later, faced a trial by fire to prove his sight. He failed, dying from burns and leaving the so-called miracle wrapped in doubt. After the grueling trials at Antioch, the Crusaders paused for months before moving south again. By early 1099 they advanced once more, moving through burnt fields and guarded crossings often short of food and water. The heat and the hostility of the lands they crossed added to the strain. But after 3 years on the road they had fixed their eyes on Jerusalem. Each mile closer tightened the resolve of an already battered army that numbered only about 12 to 15,000. A fraction of what had once set out sickness thinned their ranks. Splits among leaders simmered and supplies were limited. Jerusalem, already honoured as the holiest goal, now stood not just as an aim but as the final test. On June 7th, they finally reached Jerusalem. The city had changed hands during their journey and was now held by the Fatimid Caliphate, who had recently taken it back from the Seljuks. Its garrison was small, likely no more than 2,000 men, but the walls themselves posed the true challenge. Jerusalem had long been fortified with stone defences, towers and gates made to stop any siege. The Crusaders faced another quick problem. They had almost no proper siege engines. What little they had came through a clever but desperate move. Italian ships had brought supplies up the coast, and Crusaders broke down wood from the vessels, dragging it overland to build towers and ladders. The process took time, during which many soldiers fell ill under the summer sun. Despite this work went on to help morale, the commanders called for ritual shows of faith, processions held barefoot around the walls, fasting and prayers that echoed biblical stories, especially the siege of Jericho. They hoped divine aid would succeed where force alone might fail. The siege began in earnest in early July. Attacks with ladders failed at first as defenders threw down missiles and fire. Yet persistence and the newly built towers shifted the balance. On July 15th, a tower placed against the northern wall let the Crusaders break through the defences. Once inside, order broke into fury. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were cut down in great numbers, the scale of the bloodshed becoming infamous in later tales. Some writers painted pictures of streets flooded ankle-deep with blood. Whether stretched or not, the message was clear. The capture of the Holy City came at a staggering human cost. With the defenders killed or forced out, control of Jerusalem passed to the Crusaders. Sacred sites were seized, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were stripped and changed for Christian use, while the Church of the Holy Sepulchre became the new heart of Latin worship. Leadership fell to Godfrey of Bouillon, who took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, not King, though he held full power over the new kingdom. The conquest shocked the Islamic world and inspired joy across Europe. Hailed not just as a victory of arms, but as a strong sign of divine approval. When the armies of the First Crusade took Jerusalem in 1099, they did not simply go home. Instead, they began building new political bodies in the Eastern Mediterranean. 4 main domains emerged, each rooted in feudal ways from Europe, but placed into a foreign land. These were the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which became the centrepiece, the County of Tripoli set along the Levantine coast, the Principality of Antioch in northern Syria, and the County of Edessa, actually founded earlier in 1098 during the march to Jerusalem. Together, these states were called Outremer, meaning lands beyond the sea, a phrase showing both their physical distance from Europe and their need for constant links across that sea. Despite their European roots, these kingdoms had to adapt. They ruled lands where Latins were only a minority. Populations of Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox Syriac Christians, Armenians, Muslims and Jews made up the most. Rather than drive everyone out, the new rulers often taxed rather than expelled local communities. Over time, practical coexistence grew in some towns, with markets where Muslim and Christian traders worked side by side. At the centre of government stood Frankish rulers who brought their custom ceremonies and especially their law. The Assizes of Jerusalem became the name for their legal code. It offered a unique mix of Frankish feudal ideas and local changes, making sure rule could handle diverse realities. Different courts existed for different groups, with Latin nobles judged, apart from Eastern Christians and Muslims. The law was not just forced, but adjusted to conditions where lords had to rule over many subjects who did not share their faith or traditions. This blend of European and Levantine custom shows how Crusader power relied as much on adaptation as on conquest. Survival needed diplomacy as much as walls. Constant war was impossible for such small states surrounded by larger powers. So their leaders often made truces with Muslim rulers. They also built alliances with regional Christian groups like the Armenians, talked carefully with Byzantium, and over the next century even sought aid from distant Mongol forces. Trade deals mattered just as much, keeping supplies flowing into fragile coastal strongholds. Without such arrangements, the Latin states could not have lasted. Ties with the Byzantine Empire stayed uneasy. Crusaders had sworn oaths to give back former Byzantine lands. Yet in practice they often refused to return cities, especially where they hoped to secure their own rule. Antioch became a point of sharp dispute, starting a long pattern of distrust that poisoned relations between Greeks and Latins. For generations, economically, Outremer leaned hard on its strongest ports. Acre, Jaffa and Tyre became lifelines. Pilgrim settlers and fresh troops all travelled through them, while merchant ships carried crucial grain and weapons. To defend their holdings, the Crusaders built huge fortresses like Kakdest, Evelys and Belvoirk Castle. These stone strongholds proved so advanced that later powers used them for centuries, lasting well into the age of gunpowder. Even their coins reflected local reality. Rulers of Jerusalem made gold coins stamped with Arabic, writing a reminder that trade in the region still depended on the language and ways of earlier Islamic states. In the years after Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, new groups rose to protect and hold the fragile Latin presence in the east. These were not usual armies, nor were they ordinary monasteries. Instead, they combined both. They were old military orders, bands of men who took monastic vows while carrying arms to defend Christendom. From this unusual mix came some of the most lasting organizations of the crusading world. The first and most famous were the Knights Templar, started around 1119 by a small band of knights led by Hugh of Payens. Their original mission was simple: guard pilgrims traveling to and from Jerusalem. They set their headquarters on the Temple Mountain. From this place they took their name. Members lived under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience just like monks. Yet unlike cloistered religious, their days were filled with armed patrols and training for battle. Over time, the famous disciplined warriors grew, and so did their wealth. Nobles across Europe gave land and money, and the Templars built an international network that stretched from England and France to Syria and Palestine. They became bankers as well as fighters, holding deposits for kings, getting loans and even moving funds across borders with written orders known in far-off lands. Beside them stood the Knights Hospitaller. This order began with a charitable mission. In Jerusalem, they founded hospitals to care for sick or hurt pilgrims. Their name for giving meals, beds, and even medical help soon made them essential. Over the decades, their mission grew. They recruited knights to guard travelers and protect the hospitals themselves. By the 12th century, the hospitals had become as military as the Templars, building great forts like Kakdest, Evelys, and staffing garrisons across the Crusader states. They kept their role in healthcare, treating the wounded on battlefields, and offering some of the best organized medical help the medieval world had seen. A third order, the Teutonic Knights, came later. During the Third Crusade, German pilgrims in Acre formed them first as a hospital brotherhood, following the hospital's example. Soon they turned into a fighting order. While they played a part in the Holy Land, their efforts shifted north. In the 13th century, They launched campaigns in Prussia and the Baltic seeking to convert or conquer pagan peoples. In these regions they left a lasting mark, building castles and ruling lands well beyond the life of the Crusader states. All three orders answered straight to the Pope, not to secular kings or local lords. This independence gave them unusual power. Their wealth, lands and armies let them rival monarchs, and their loyalty to Rome kept papal influence in distant regions. Despite ideals of poverty and chastity, they got caught in politics, property, disputes and fights for influence. The secrecy of the Templars, complete with their own codes and rites, later fed centuries of rumour and myth. Meanwhile, the hospitals stayed known as both warriors and caretakers, healing Christians, Jews and Muslims alike. The shock that started the Second Crusade came in 1140, for when the county of Edessa, one of the First Crusade estates, fell to the forces of Zeng, the powerful at Abed of Mosul and Aleppo. This loss sent a wave of fear through Christendom, because Edessa had been seen as a key buffer protecting the safer lands of Antioch and Jerusalem. The fall was not a distant matter for European rulers. They threatened to undo the fragile foothold set in the east after the First Crusade, and showed the Crusader states were far from permanent. For many, the disaster at Edessa made it clear Christian hold on the Holy Land would not last without fresh military help from Europe. Pope Eugenius III acted fast, issuing a formal call for a new crusade. His appeal might not have stirred the needed zeal without the work of Bernard the Clever, one as the most celebrated churchman of the age. Bernard's fame as a Cistercian abbot and spiritual leader gave the crusade legitimacy, and his passionate sermons carried great weight across Europe. He promised spiritual rewards greater than those of the First Crusade, urging nobles, knights and commoners alike that God demanded new effort. Under his persuasion, the idea of crusading spread like fire once more, and this time the campaign drew the eyes of kings themselves. Unlike the armies that had marched before, led by nobles with limited means, the Second Crusade featured two crowned rulers at its head, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Their involvement raised hopes to a new level. It was thought that with real monarchs leading the way, logistics, manpower and commitment would far outdo the earlier crusade. The hope in the West was that the assured strength would not only retake Edessa, but also spread Christian power more securely across the Levant. What followed, though, was far from the grand vision seen at its start. The armies of both kings took heavy losses even before reaching the Holy Land. Marching across Anatolia, they faced planning shortages of supplies and constant attacks by Turkish forces. Bad communication between groups only made things worse. By the time the Crusaders finally united in Jerusalem, their forces were worn out and their numbers low. In 1148, the leaders made a controversial choice to strike Damascus. The city had not been hostile. In fact, it had often worked with the Crusader states against shared rivals. Yet political ambition led them to target it anyway. The siege lasted only for days before being left in chaos. The defeat marked a shameful end, with no win gained and little glory won. Though the Levant campaign fell apart, crusading did not stop. In the same era, all the Europeans waged war against pagan groups in the Baltic, and forces in Portugal won a rare victory by taking Lisbon from Muslim rule. Meanwhile, the disaster at Damascus convinced Muslim leaders that dealing with the Crusader states was foolish. A shift in views that later opened the way for figures like Saladin to unite resistance. Amid all this, the Crusade made another lasting story back in Europe. The part played by Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose presence and troubles on campaign played a role in the eventual end of her marriage to Louis VII. The fall of Edessa in 1140 was a turning point for the Crusaders. It came as a crushing loss, but in the Islamic world, it signaled a new chance. Before Zeng, Muslim responses to the Crusaders were often divided. Political splits, already told in earlier chapters, had left the region open to outside move. What changed was the rise of Zeng, a powerful Atabeg who ruled both Mosul and Aleppo. He knew war well, but unlike many of his time, he began to fight the Crusaders as more than just political rivalry or defense of land. By showing it was Jade Zeng, I cast it as religious duty, able to unite different groups under one banner. His will to Edessa made him widely praised, not simply as a conqueror but as a defender of Islam itself. Still then, his leadership had limits. He used fear and harsh shows of power to keep loyalty among his people and allies. Support for him often came from dread of his revenge, not deep personal faith. This way stopped him from building wider coalitions, and his sudden killing in 1146 with no clear plan to keep what he had gained. His death might have undone his work, but events soon put his son Nur-ad-Din in place to take his authority and change it into something far more lasting. Nur-ad-Din proved different from his father in both style and sight. Taking Aleppo, he carefully spread his reach, slowly bringing Damascus under his control and uniting much of Syria under a single steadier rule. He joined political and military skill with a name for personal piety, which set him apart from the fear tied to Zenite. His rule backed religious and learning places, including the start of madrasas that strengthened Sunni orthodoxy. He built hospitals and stressed welfare work that won him love and helped cement loyalty among religious scholars and common folk alike. Militarily, he worked step by step to weaken the Crusader presence. He avoided rash campaigns, choosing to pressure the lands with raids, fortress building, unwind games that constantly reminded the Franks of their weakness. By showing himself as the true champion of Islam, he undercut the authority and right of the Crusaders, leaving them more alone and defensive. At the same time, his court became a training ground for leaders who would later change the struggle further. Among them was Saladin, in whom Nur-ad-Din backed during his early command in Egypt. The legacy of Nur-ad-Din went beyond military moves. He set Damascus as a center of learning and health care, and one of his most striking acts was the founding of a public hospital that included special care for mental health, an idea far ahead of its time compared to Europe then. As a sign of his wider mission, he even ordered a wooden pulpit meant for the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, a place he never lived to see taken back. Decades after his death, Saladin honored that vision by putting the pulpit in its intended home. Saladin used a fibon I remembered in European tales as Saladin began his path, not as a ruler, but as a soldier in the service of Nur-ad-Din. His rise was tied close to the politics of Egypt in the mid-12th century, at a time when the Fatimid Caliphate still held power there. The Fatimids stood for a Shia rule that often opposed Sunni powers like Nur-ad-Din, which made Egypt a tempting target for both Crusaders and their Muslim rivals. In 1160, Saladin reached Egypt as part of Nur-ad-Din's movement to counter both internal fights in Cairo and the growing influence of Latin forces. Though first overshadowed by his uncle Shirkas, Saladin soon stood out as a skilled commander, handling both military moves and political talk. When Shirkuh died suddenly in 1116, the young leader found himself placed to take over. With Nur-ad-Din's approval, he was made vizier of Egypt, serving briefly under the Fatimid frame. Far from a passive manager, Saladin at once began building his authority. In 1170, only 2 years later, he formally ended the Fatimid Caliphate. By swapping Shia leadership for Sunni ways, he not only tied Egypt and fought to Nur-ad-Din's side, but also secured independent control for himself and his family. With Cairo as his base, Saladin now held access to Egypt's farm wealth, which gave him a steady resource stream for later campaigns. After Nur-ad-Din's sudden death in 1170, Saladin seized the chance to grow. Moving from Egypt to Syria, he used a careful mix of diplomacy and war. In some cities, he won loyalty through talk. In others, he turned to siege and pressure. By showing his act as part of a wider religious mission, he strengthened his claim to rightful leadership in the eyes of the Muslim people. Over the next decade, he slowly united Egypt and Syria into one political sphere, a feat not done since before the Crusades upset the region's balance. What sets Saladin's rule apart was how he paired political skill with deeply made religious messaging. He backed Friday sermons or put BS in his own name to state his pledge to jihad. This was not just military talk. It became a way to bind different parts of his realm under one shared cause. The plan also helped him weakened both rivals and Crusader rulers, framing himself as the chief defender of Islam's sacred spaces. At the same time, he did not hesitate to remove possible threats in his circle, using killings or exile when needed to secure his place. Though later praised in the West as a model of chivalry, Saladin's path to power was hard-edged and carefully countered. His joining of Egypt and Syria gave him unmatched economic resources, manpower, and religious authority. On that base, he placed himself to start campaigns that would change the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. On July 4, 1187, the Crusader triumphed the Holy Land met its worst disaster at the Battle of Hattin. The fight happened near the Sea of Galilee, where Saladin's forces wrecked the main Frankish army in one decisive meet. Events unfolded after King Guy of Lusignan led his men from a safe spot in a try to save the fortress city of Tiberias under siege. The move was poorly timed. The countryside had been burnt by Saladin's forces, leaving little water or cover. Under the blazing summer sun, the Crusader host marched across bare ground, and tiredness set in before they reached their goal. Saladin used patient tactics to make the march even harder. His troops slit brush fires to smoke and choke the coming enemy, while horse archers struck fast and pulled back. By the time the Crusader army neared the volcanic hills called the Horns of Hattin, thirst and weariness had worn down their order. Here Muslim forces closed in on every side. Surrounded and unable to reach the waters of Lake Tiberias, the army fell under waves of attacks. The true cross or relic carried into battle as a strong sign of God's favor was taken. This loss held both practical and mental weight as soldiers had marched believing divine protection went with them. The defeat left most of the Crusader nobility in Saladin's hands. King Guy himself was taken prisoner, along with many lords who had ruled the Latin states. While ransom talks freed several of them, Saladin picked out the Knights Templar and Knight Hospitaller among the captives. These military orders had long been seen as fierce foes bound by religious vows to fight to the death. Saladin judged them too dangerous to free or swap, and he personally ordered their killing. In the aftermath, resistance across the Latin states crumbled. With the Crusader field armies gone, forts and towns fell in quick order. Within months, Saladin moved against the final prize, Jerusalem itself. In October of 1187, the city gave up after a short siege. Instead of repeating the slaughter seen almost a century earlier when Crusaders had first seized Jerusalem, Saladin offered more measured terms. Civilians could buy their freedom, while clergy stayed to care for sacred sites. Greek Orthodox churches kept open, and though costly, the deal stopped large-scale massacre. Saladin knew the propaganda or worth of acting different from the conquerors of 1099. The fall of Jerusalem echoed through Europe. Writers told of public grief, with church bells quiet and processions held to mourn the loss of the holy city. The failure sparked fresh calls for action, laying the ground for the Third Crusade. What lasted most strongly was the symbolic loss of the true cross, never found again and left to fade from history, marking one of the greatest emblematic defeats of medieval Christendom. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 made an uproar across Europe that fast turned into one of the largest military answers the Latin West had yet tried. The Third Crusade gathered not only knights and minor lords, but was led by the strongest monarchs of the time: Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. The hope was that their combined strength would restore Christian control of Jerusalem and undo Saladin's stunning wins. Each leader raised impressive forces, with Barbarossa's German army by far the biggest. Their scale made many think success was sure. Yet the campaign soon met setbacks no amount of men could stop. Barbarossa left first, leading tens of thousands overland across Anatolia. His march showed the logistical trials of keeping such a huge force far from home. In 1190, before he even reached the Holy Land, Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Cilicia. Word of his death spread fear through the ranks, and much of the army fell apart. Only a small remnant fought on to join the French and English kings by sea. This sudden collapse shifted the weight of the crusade onto Richard and Philip, whose uneasy partnership shaped the rest of the campaign. When they arrived, their first major goal was the port city of Acre, already under siege by strained Crusader forces. The effort dragged on for months, with grim fighting and sickness eating away at both sides. By the summer of 1191, Acre finally gave up. Though a big victory, the siege widened distrust between Philip and Richard. Fights over spoils and influence soon convinced Philip to go back to France, leaving Richard to command almost alone. His leadership, though debated, was marked by clear military talent. Richard's fame was secured at the Battle of Suf later that year. Facing Saladin's mobile forces, he used strict discipline to control his knights, holding them from breaking ranks despite constant harassment. At the key moment, he unleashed a charge that broke enemy lines and forced retreat. This win lifted Crusader spirits, but did not bring them any nearer to the walls of Jerusalem. Time after time, Richard moved within sight of the city, only to stop. Worries overstretched supply lines, the risk of being surrounded, and the lack of strong reinforcements led him to put coastal stronghold first. Jaffa and other ports were secured, making sure Crusader survival, but Jerusalem stayed out of reach. By 1190, both sides faced exhaustion. Long war hurt resources and morale, and neither could achieve a final win. This led to the Treaty of Jaffa. Its terms gave the Franks the thin coastal strip, while Christian pilgrims could safely reach Jerusalem under Muslim control. The outcome pleased few and left the central issue unsolved. Richard never reached the city he had set out to take back. On his trip home, he was captured in Europe and ransomed at a staggering cost. Saladin, meanwhile, died in 1193, said to have given most of his wealth away, leaving little at his death, despite ruling one of the largest realms of the Muslim world. Women seldom appear in medieval battle tales, but within the story of the Crusades their presence is clear. They came in different ranks and held different duties, where most were not seen in frontline military roles. Nobles, queens and regents often shaped policy and power fights, while ordinary women backed the day-to-day work of armies in the field. Their contributions show the crusading experience was not limited to men-at-arms, but stretched across households, families, and communities that travelled east together. Among the most famous was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who joined her husband Louis VII during the Second Crusade. Though sometimes recalled more for the disputes around her than her practical part, her involvement showed how noble women could command attention and sway choices. Another figure of note was Melisende of Jerusalem. She ruled as regent for her young son Baldwin III and used her authority with confidence and rarity for women in medieval Europe. She directed funds to religious groups, oversaw court matters, and effectively governed the kingdom during a time of internal strain. Her rule highlighted that leadership in the Crusader states was not always tied to male authority. Women also left marks in chronicles for their presence in combat. Accounts tell of women using weapons from walls, shooting arrows, or riding into danger beside men. These cases were not common, but the fact they were written down at all shows how desperate some sieges grew and how blurred the lines between civilian and soldier could be. Even so, most women tied to crusading forces were not fighters but gave labor armies heavily relied on. Wives followed their husbands, caring for children and goods while on campaign. Servants, cooks and laundresses kept the practical life of camps. Midwives were there too, since crusading lasted years and families often lived within the mobile communities of an army. Diplomacy was another field where women left their mark, though less seen. Marriages set between noble families of different regions or even across faiths made networks that could ease talks or secure truces. In port cities like Tyre or Acre, where cultural lines were crossed, daily women's ties gave them sway that reached past formal politics. Religious women added another layer. Nuns, mystics and pilgrims gave spiritual push, sometimes through visions or prophecies that shaped fighter morale. Their writings and names remind us the emotional and devotional life of the Crusades was not controlled by male clerics alone. At the Siege of Lisbon in 1147 during the Second Crusade, local women on both sides took an active part in the fighting. From roofs and walls they threw stones, fire and boiling water into enemy ranks, turning homes into small forts. Centuries later, chroniclers still recall their acts. and Eleanor of Aquitaine, with her group of finely dressed noblewomen, was accused of turning the campaign into a court on the move, where the fair or not these tales show how visible women could become in a theatre thought to be ruled by men. The Fourth Crusade began in 1198 with a very different plan from how it ended. Pope Innocent III wanted the Crusaders to retake Jerusalem by hitting first of Egypt, a rich and strategic centre of Muslim power. The idea was that by taking Egypt, the Crusaders would gain a base from which they could more easily project force into the Levant. But bringing such a strategy to life needed transport across the Mediterranean. To meet that need, deals were made with Venice, whose strong navy would carry a huge army east. What happened? Like shifted the whole direction of the crusade away from its first purpose. The Crusaders promised payment to Venice for the fleet, but when the time came they could not raise the agreed sum. Venice, under the lead of the old but sharp Doge Enrico and Lode, did not just drop the cause. Instead, he offered the upset Crusaders a deal. They could pay a large part of their debt if they helped Venice take the Adriatic port city of Zora. The trouble was Zara was itself a Christian city and a papal vassal. Innocent III had forbidden such an act, insisting holy war must not turn against fellow Christians. But the armies, desperate to go on, followed Angelo's plan. Zara fell after a siege in 1202, marking the first big turn from the Crusades' stated goal. While they stayed there, events took another unexpected turn. Messengers sent by Alexios IV, the exiled son of a removed Byzantine emperor, came to ask help in putting him back in power in Constantinople. In swap for military support, Alexios promised huge sums of money, supplies, and even the church's reunion under papal authority. For leaders short on funds, the deal seemed too good to refuse. The momentum of the campaign shifted once more away from taking back Jerusalem to fixing dynastic fight inside the Byzantine Empire. In 1203, the Crusaders entered Constantinople, putting Alexios IV in as co-emperor. Yet promises of payment could not be fully kept, and soon anger grew among the city's people. Alexios was overthrown and killed with no money, few supplies, and rising hate from Constantinople's citizens. The Crusaders found themselves stuck. In April 1204, they turned to force. Over 3 days, the city was stormed and hit with wide looting and ruin. Reports tell of churches stripped of relics, icons smashed or taken, and even attacks on monastic groups. On the ruins of Byzantine power, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was declared. Crusader and Venetian nobles split former Byzantine lands to suit their own dreams. The sack left deep wounds that would never truly heal. The split between Catholic and Orthodox churches, already bad, became permanent after 1204. Byzantium itself, weakened and broken, never regained its earlier strength. Relics taken east still stand in western cities, like Venice, where the bronze horses of the Hippodrome were laced on street-marked basilica. Even Innocent III, first angry, later accepted the outcome, seeing some gain in a papal foothold over Constantinople. The year 1212 made one of the oddest episodes in the long history of crusading. Later chronicles tell what came to be called the Children's Crusade, an event that gripped writers for centuries, though its details stay unsure. The story is often told as if thousands of Christian children marched with the belief their innocence would succeed where armies had failed. In truth, what happened was far less clear, involving a mix of youth, peasants, and poor adults caught up in religious zeal. Two figures appear in the accounts. In France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes is said to have preached a message that God had picked him to lead followers to take back Jerusalem. To the east, in Germany, Nicholas of Cologne played a like part, gathering large groups of young people fired by his vision. These leaders inspired processions that stretched for miles, gaining notice as people marched across the countryside. The gatherings were not planned in secret. Rather, they were public movements, showing a level of piety that drew support from parents, clergy, and onlookers. Unlike earlier crusades, these were not blessed by the church. No papal bull allowed them. They grew on their own, reflecting the intense religious air of the early 13th century. Prophecy, visions, and the idea that the sins of knights had doomed military crusades fed the belief that only the purity of children could renew divine favor. The movements leaned on strong symbols, not weapons. Those taking part hoped for miracles like seas parting to let them pass, echoing biblical tales of salvation. The French group reportedly made its way south to Marseilles. Chroniclers claimed that once there many expected the Mediterranean itself to open before them, giving a straight path to the Holy Land. No miracle came. Instead they faced hard choices. Some went back to their homes while others boarded ships offered by merchants who promised safe passage. According to later tales of 7 ships that carried them to sank in storms, drowning all on board, while the rest reached North Africa. Their many were said to be sold into slavery, a betrayal that stood in sharp contrast to the hopeful start of their pilgrimage. Nicholas's German following crossed the Alps into Italy, enduring hunger and tiredness along the way. Their hardships soon scattered them, and while Nicholas himself vanishes from the records and stories, so he tried another journey and was later killed for his failed promises. For most taking part, the end is a letdown. They simply drifted back to their villages, their visions unmet. This movement shows a wider tradition of unofficial crusades. It reflected bold wants for lay part in religious fight going past traditional authorities. The Children's Crusade showed both the power and danger of mass religious zeal when cut off from practical leadership and planning. Though often romanticized in later centuries as an innocent tragedy of literal children, the truth points more to teens and poo groups who stand for the depths of popular belief in an age defined by spiritual fire and hope for divine help. The Fifth Crusade was launched with a focus on Egypt, not straight on Jerusalem, because many leaders in Europe thought the Nile Delta was the true key to controlling the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt held huge farm wealth and its rulers commanded the resources that backed resistance to the Crusader states. In 1217 armies gathered under figures like King Andrew II of Hungary and Leopold VI of Austria, with the papal legate Pelagius taking a central part in directing policy. Their target became Amiata, a city on the Nile, but controlled access into Egypt's interior. Taking it needed a long siege stretching through hardship and sickness. But by 1219 the city fell. It seemed for a moment this campaign might succeed where past tries had failed. The victory soon turned empty. Al-Minas Kamel, the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, offered the Crusaders a diplomatic answer. He proposed trading Jerusalem and other holy places in swap for their pullout from Egypt. Yet the leadership in the Crusader camp did not take the plan. Instead, fired by their recent win, the army pushed deeper into Egyptian land in search of a final triumph. The choice proved disastrous when floods on the Nile rose in 1221. The advancing Crusaders found themselves trapped on flooded ground. The river cut their supply lines. Sickness spread through the ranks and morale fell apart. The army had little choice but to give up. Damietta, the hard-won gain of the campaign, was handed back. The whole effort ended in shame, and many saw it as proof reckless dream had outweighed practical sense. Several years later, another try emerged, this time under the direction of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. The Sixth Crusade looked very different from the military campaigns before it. Frederick had already angered Pope Gregory IX by delaying his leave for the Holy Land, leading to his excommunication. When he finally sailed in 1228, his standing with the Church was strained. But he made up for it with strategy of another kind. He relied not on battles but on talk. Meeting with Al-Minas Kamel, the same Egyptian sultan who had faced the Fifth Crusade, Frederick struck a deal. Al-Minas Kamel faced rival claims within the Muslim world, and a treaty offered him space. The two leaders signed the Treaty of Jaffa in 1229, giving back Jerusalem, Bethlehem and Nazareth to Christian control without one major clash of arms. Muslims kept access to Jerusalem and Islamic authorities went on running the Temple Mount. This setup was almost unique in crusading history, a peaceful handover of the Holy City. Despite its success, Frederick's diplomacy stirred anger. Many Crusaders and church officials saw his ways as raw, especially since he had been excommunicated when he claimed the crown of Jerusalem for himself. This settlement lasted less than 10 years before Muslim forces restored rule. Yet the event showed a new pattern. Diplomacy, not just war, could shift control in the crusading world. Life on a crusade was not defined only by the clash of swords. For most taking part, it meant endless marches under the sun, nights on rough ground, and weeks of hunger and thirst. The journey across Anatolia or the deserts of the Levant was not just tiring but deadly. Men carried their lives on their backs, often walking barefoot or with worn shoes that gave little protection. Long campaigns meant soldiers grew weaker before they even met a foe, and the strain of travel itself could be as dangerous as battle. Food was always unsure. Troops tried to live on whatever supplies they managed to carry. Grain boiled into porridge, dried beans, bits of salted meat, or the ship's hard bread known as biscuit, which often had to be soaked before it could be chewed. Once supplies thinned, desperation took over. In some campaigns, desperation drove soldiers to extremes, leaving whole units as foragers scouring the wild or fighting over scraps. In the worst moments, hunger led some to search for weeds or chew on grass, while starvation slowly ate away at morale. Even when the soldiers found food, clean water presented another crisis. Mediterranean summers left wells dry, and in dry regions where water did exist was sometimes fouled by defenders hoping to weaken besieging armies. Men drank from stale pools or mixed wine with bad water to hide the taste, leading to outbreaks of dysentery. Beer and wine were safer, but limited, rarely enough for the numbers marching east. Lack of water alone killed thousands during summer marches and first shaped the very beat of crusading warfare. Conditions in camp made things worse. Armies settled outside a walled town for weeks during sieges, but latrines were often shallow pits, easily fouled and placed near water supplies. Soldiers and animals crowded onto the same ground, spreading vermin in fast. Lice and fleas were nearly everywhere, and with rot from unburied bodies, nearby sickness raced through the rows of tents. Epidemics sometimes wiped out more crusaders in a month than years of fighting could. Gear added to the hardship. Knights with proper mail coats suffered under heavy layers of iron in the Levantine suns, sometimes overheating before battle began. True foot soldiers lacked protective armor altogether, relying on padded gambesons, spears, or reused farm tools. Weapon qualities varied widely, with many ill-armed men thrown into the same battles as the rich elite. This imbalance often decided who lived long enough to fight another day. Army order was uneven. Some leaders kept codes of discipline and rationing, while others ignored control. Soldiers at times turned on villagers meant to supply them, looted churches, or fought within their own ranks. Alcohol fed brawls, yet religion structured the same communities. Daily prayers, processions, and visits to relics reminded fighters death would come fast. Priests heard confession before attacks, so men believed they entered battle ready for salvation. Armies rarely moved alone. Families, merchants, artisans, and prostitutes marched beside them. These groups gave critical support, fixing weapons, cooking, and caring for the hurt. Though their presence slowed movement and complicated logistics, the staggering toll was clear. During the First Crusade's passage through Anatolia, nearly half of those taking part never lived to see Jerusalem. Some grew so desperate for water that they split open dead horses to drink whatever liquid stayed inside. While battles in the eastern Mediterranean often rule our review of crusading, the idea of holy war also shaped conflicts within Europe itself. The papacy pushed campaigns not only against distant Muslim powers, but also against nearby groups. It saw as blocks to Christian growth or threats to religious unity. By redefining local wars as crusades, church leaders stretched the spiritual promises once saved for Jerusalem to campaigns much closer to home. This shift let rulers claim they were defending Christendom, while also chasing land, power, and influence under papal blessing. The Iberian Peninsula became one of the most lasting fronts of crusading action. For centuries, Christian and Muslim kingdoms lived together, trade and fought across the region. By the late 11th century, renewed conflict in Spain was reframed as part of the wider crusading movement. Wins like the taking of Toledo in 1085 became key signs of Christian advance. When Lisbon was taken in 1147 with help from passing northern crusaders, its fall was celebrated as a holy triumph equal to events in the Levant. Monarchs of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal bet indulgences and papal approval, linking their wars of reconquest to the larger crusading cause. Past military reward joining knights gained privileges at home, including land and lower taxes, making the campaign in Spain both spiritually blessed and materially rewarding. Far to the north, another form of crusade unfolded along the shores of the Baltic. Here Catholic lords and religious orders aimed at pagan groups like the Prussians, Lithuanians and Livonians. The Northern Crusades were justified as a mission to spread Christianity, but they also became a tool for conquest and colonization. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword and later the Teutonic Knights founded fortified settlements, churches and administrative centers, tightening control over lands won through war. Resistance by the native tribes often ended with forced baptisms and mass removals, and in some regions whole cultures vanished. Unlike the Crusades to the Levant, which faded after the 13th century, these campaigns stretched well into the 15th century. In fact, Lithuania did not accept Christianity officially until late in that time, making it one of the last major European regions converted under pressure of crusading force. Crusading violence was not limited to non-Christians. In southern France, papal authorities backed the Albigensian Crusader war against Cathars between 1209 and 1229. The Cathars taught a dualist faith rejected by the Catholic Church as heresy. Northern French nobles were urged by the papacy to march south, and the campaign ended with wide killings, burnings and displacement of whole communities. The city of Béziers became infamous when armies slaughtered thousands of people without difference between Cathars and Catholics. In the long run, the Crusade not only destroyed the Cathar movement, but also brought the rich region of Languedoc under royal French control, reshaping the political map of France. Through these campaigns, crusading became more and more flexible, adaptable to the dreams of kings, nobles and the papacy alike. An idea once died, taking back Jerusalem, now served as reason for wars of conquest, suppression and growth across Europe's edges. Far from a single event, crusading turned into a political and religious tool that lasted for centuries. King Louis IX of France stands out among crusading kings not only because he led expeditions, but also because the church later made him a saint. His image as a pious ruler contrasts sharply with the hard realities of his military adventures. Both of his campaigns ended in disaster, yet they show how much weight the crusading ideal still held in the 13th century, even at a time when earlier setbacks might have discouraged others. The Seventh Crusade began in 1248, with Louis aiming his attention toward Egypt. Like earlier crusaders, he thought holding Egypt would allow a permanent foothold in the region and a clear path to Jerusalem. His army was large, carefully supplied and backed by the resources of the French crown. When Louis landed at Damietta in 1249, success seemed immediate. The port city fell fast to his forces, raising hopes the strategy might work. Yet that momentum did not last. From Damietta, Louis pushed toward Cairo, convinced that controlling the Egyptian capital would break Muslim power. The campaign faltered almost at once. Heavy floods from the Nile slowed the army's progress across marshy ground, while resistance from local forces grew stronger. At the town of Al-Mansura, the Crusaders marched into a set trap. Many nobles and knights fell in chaotic fighting through the streets, and large parts of the army were killed or trapped. Louis himself was taken prisoner in 1250 beside his brothers and key commanders. To secure release, he agreed to a costly ransom and the pullout from Damietta. Though his campaign had collapsed, Louis did not leave the region right away. He stayed in the Levant for several years, directing funds toward the repair and strengthening of coastal cities still under Christian control. His presence steadied these outposts and encouraged continued resistance, but he failed to gain new ground. By 1250, for he went back to France, where his rule went on with reputation whole as a devout and determined leader. 16 years later, Louis took the cross again. In 1270, he launched what became known as the Eighth Crusade. This time his target was Tunis, in North Africa. The plan was to build a base of operations near Egypt and persuade the local ruler either to convert or ally with him. Yet within weeks of landing, the army was hit by a sudden outbreak of sickness, like a dysentery or typhus. The epidemic tore through the camp and Louis himself grew ill. He died on August 25th, reportedly lying on ashes in a sign of penance, whispering the name of Jerusalem as his life ended. After his death, his remains were treated in a way common for kings who died far from home. His body was taken apart, boiled, to separate flesh from bone and shared for burial. His death marked not only the failure of another expedition, but also the fading of crusading zeal at its height. By the mid-13th century, Crusader power in the eastern Mediterranean had been cut to sketchy strongholds along the coast. At the same time, a new regime rose in Egypt that would soon define the final chapter of the Crusades. These were the Mamluks, a military elite first made up of enslaved soldiers, often of Turk or Circassian origin. Trained from youth and converted to Islam, they grew into one of the most disciplined fighting forces of the medieval world. In 1250, they seized power in Cairo and built a dynasty that lasted for centuries. Their rulers joined tight military control with religious authority, cheering themselves as defenders of Islam, while chasing a relentless plan to remove the remaining Latin states. One of the most famous Mamluk leaders was Sultan Ibars, who ruled from 1260 to 1277. He gained fame by defeating the Mongols at the Battle of Injait in 1260, a win that ended the threat of Mongol expansion into Syria and marked a turning point in regional history. With his place secure, the Ibars aimed his armies at Crusader forts. He used siege engines able to throw huge stones under mined walls with mining, and used mind pressure to break resistance. His campaign steadily cut Crusader holdings, but he also used diplomacy, where useful, making truces with some Latin leaders to isolate others. While feared as a commander, Ibars was equally known for his administrative reforms at home, including a postal relay system with signal towers and carrier pigeons that kept messages fast and reliable across his empire. By the late 13th century, the remaining Latin lands were in coastal strips, centered on Acre and Tripoli. They lacked fresh troops from Europe, where zeal for crusades had faded. The papacy's calls fell on deaf ears. Kingdoms looked to their own conflicts, and the isolation of the Crusader states became ever more clear. When Ibars died, his successors carried on the same plan with will. Sultan Law untook Tripoli in 1289, wiping out one of the last major Crusader domains. 2 years later, his son Alminus Ashrid Khalil moved on Acre, the largest Crusader city, the symbolic heart of what stayed of Outrema. In 1291, after a fierce and bloody siege, Acre fell. Latin power in the Holy Land collapsed completely. The survivors retreated to Cyprus or returned to Europe, and with the loss of Acre, no serious try was ever made to rebuild the Crusader states. The Mamluks made sure these wins were permanent. They destroyed forts, killed garrisons, and stopped Latin settlers from retaking ground. With this, the era of Crusader Outrema came to an end. During the fall of Acre, many civilians crowded into Templar forts by the harbour, which held for days until its great tower suddenly fell, crushing both defenders and attackers. Despite such brutality, Ibars himself stayed admired for his rule, balancing his legacy as both wrecker of Crusader kingdoms and builder of a tightly ordered Islamic empire. And so this chapter of history slowly fades into the quiet flow of time. Some mysteries remain unanswered, some truths continue to shape our world. We have walked through the past together and learned what it can teach us. If you carry this knowledge forward with you through each day, then the echoes of history will never be lost. Thank you for listening, and until next time, let the past remain alive in your mind.